Hey guys, this is Help Us to Love, and we hope you get a blessing from it. There's a love so high that you cannot get over. That same love so wide, it'll take forever just to get round it. But love died somewhere behind that cross you wear, and you're afraid when you look at me. That ain't real love, not the kind from above. Oh yeah, there's a friend of mine, oh, that sticks closer than a brother. Love laid down his life, so why do we still fight one another? All this hate I see on the TV screen in my country, tears of thee. God help us to love the way that you love me. God help us to love the way that you love me. Oh, this world is weeping, hurting, broken, and begging for change. Oh yeah, still we are marching, praying, dying, and things stay the same. Oh, when will we see till everyone's free? There'll never be peace between you and me. Oh, your love is a cure for the rich and the poor. God, please will you open our eyes? 'Cause I want a love so wide that you cannot get over. I want a love so wide, it'll take forever just to get round it. But it don't come cheap, it takes everything to make love more than a dream. God help us to love, God help us to love. Oh yeah, help us to love the way that you love me.
50 days after the Passover, all the Jewish people would come back to Jerusalem once again to celebrate the feast known as Pentecost. They would come from far and wide to celebrate the end of the barley harvest and the beginning of the wheat harvest and pray for God's providence over what was going to be produced. It is very possible that the disciples of Jesus were there in Jerusalem at the time thinking that they were only a part of the feast just like everybody else and expected to celebrate in the same way as all of their country people. In Acts chapter 2 verse 1 and 3, it says this: when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each one of them. Both wind and fire are symbols of the activity of the Spirit. This is literally the presence of God filling the entire space. Except for this time, the presence of God wasn't in human flesh like they had seen before in Jesus. This time, the presence of God came like a raw spiritual energy directly from heaven, and it filled not only the entire room, but it entered the people and filled them and changed them. It says that when the Spirit came, it came with the noise like a violent wind. I want to make this point. Not only is God loud, God is not afraid of loud noises. You might have grown up in a church that had a sign above the pulpit that said, "Reverence thy sanctuary." And what do we mean when we think of reverence? Well, we think that means the music can't be too loud and the kids can't play too loud and the babies can't cry too loud. But I don't have time to get into what reverence actually is, but I can tell you that it is not the same as quietness. Because here, when the presence of God comes into this room, it comes with the sound of a violent wind and it fills the entire place. God cannot be scared away by loud noises. And it goes on. And after these men are filled with this presence of God, they get this ability and this confidence to go out and speak about the miraculousness of God to all of the people in the streets. Except this time when they speak, something incredible happens and everyone is hearing what they say in the local dialect from the town of which they came. People are incredibly amazed at what is taking place. And in verse 14, it says, "Then Peter stood up with the 11. He raised his voice and addressed the crowd. 'Fellow Jews and all who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say.'" Peter goes on to preach this brilliant sermon. He explains how the death and resurrection of Jesus was part of God's plan and puts it in the Old Testament context so that they could understand it. What is amazing about this is that 10 days before, Peter had no idea what the gospel meant. 10 days before, Peter was still hoping that Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans, but here he is seeing an opportunity to preach, and he gets up and he preaches a phenomenal sermon, and 3,000 people at the end of his sermon say, "Peter, what do we do with this information? What do we do now that you've told us about Jesus?" And Peter says, "You need to repent and you need to be baptized." And 3,000 people were added to this small group of disciples of 120, blowing the growth through the roof. And Peter is preaching without sermon notes, without a microphone, literally screaming about the goodness of God with all of the volume that he can force out of his lungs. And people are converted to Jesus and the church grows out of control. I can imagine the debrief later that night where the disciples gather together and all they can say is, "Today, that was pretty crazy, wasn't it?" Despite the fact that these men had zero grasp on what God was going to do through them, once they were filled with the Spirit, they became the very definition of world-changing people.